10 terrifying unsolved serial murders. Welcome back to Creepshow, where we delve into the darkest corners of human nature and bring you spine-chilling tales that keep you up at night. Today, we're diving into the realm of the unknown, exploring the terrifying mysteries of serial killers who have eluded capture. Brace yourselves, because these stories are not for the faint of heart. Here are 10 terrifying unsolved serial murders that continue to haunt the world to this day. Those who watch Creepshow have a certain amount of interest in serial killers, which is not surprising. It appears that people have a sick curiosity regarding the monsters who are responsible for these serial murders. In fact, this topic is the subject of our most popular list of all time. The idea that these killers will eventually be tracked down and apprehended is something that we would like to believe, but unfortunately, this is not always the case. Some people who commit serial murders are able to evade capture for years, even decades, while others are never apprehended. There are 10 persons depicted in this film, and any one of them may be out and about in the streets right now. Number 10. February 9th Killer. By herself in her apartment on February 9th, a Hispanic woman was attacked and murdered in a suburb of Salt Lake City. The incident occurred while she was alone. Unbelievable as it may seem, the exact identical occurrence occurred again in the years 2006 and 2008. DNA examination of evidence acquired at both places would subsequently reveal that the killings were perpetrated by the same individual, whom the media instantly christened the February 9th Killer. This was despite the fact that, at first, the repeated circumstances were thought to be a macabre coincidence. Sonia Mejia, the perpetrator of the crime that occurred in 2006, was pregnant at the time that she was assaulted and strangled. Some of the objects that were taken from her residence were never found, despite the fact that they were stolen. In the crime that occurred in 2008, Damiana Castillo was found dead at her apartment, which was located around 1 mile away from Mejia's. In both cases, there was no sign of forced entry, and while the investigative agencies involved were and still are extremely reluctant to label the perpetrator a serial killer, that certainly seems to be an apt description of a man who kills 2 women in a very similar fashion, on the same date, 2 years apart. Despite the fact that the police have a hazy description of the murderer, they are not revealing how they arrived at that description. Furthermore, although they have a DNA profile, they do not have a match for that profile. This leaves the possibility that the perpetrator will never be apprehended unless he is eventually forced to hand over a DNA sample for a crime that is unrelated to the murder. Number 9. The Phantom Killer. There has only been one case of serial murder that has been reported in the twin cities of Texarkana, Texas, and Texarkana, Arkansas. This particular crime, which occurred in 1946, caused the region to be paralyzed with fear for a number of months. There were a total of 5 persons killed and 3 more injured as a result of the attacks, which took place throughout the night on weekends, approximately every few weekends during that time period. A horror movie called The Town That Dreaded Sundown was inspired by the case 30 years after it occurred because it had such a profound impact on the public's imagination. The initial victims, Mary Jean Larry and Jimmy Hollis, were the only ones who were able to provide a description of their assailant, and it was more horrifying than it was helpful. In their description, they depicted a man who stood 6 feet tall and wore a plain white sack over his head. The sack had holes cut out for the eyes and mouth. Because the sole other person who survived the attack did not get a chance to see it, it is unknown whether or not the perpetrator wore this mask throughout the other attacks. The perpetrator of the murders always utilized a handgun with a caliber of .32, almost always carried out his murders 3 weeks apart, and always carried them out in the dead of night. Immediately following the commission of one of the murders, Sheriff William Presley made a statement to the press, stating, "This killer is the luckiest person I have ever known." Nobody is able to recognize him in any manner, and no one is able to see him or hear him in time. It was because of this that the media began to refer to him as the Phantom Killer, and the murders themselves came to be known as the Texarkana Moonlight Murders later on. Ul Swinney, one of the suspects, was sentenced to prison in 1947 for committing multiple thefts of automobiles and was freed in 1973. However, he was never prosecuted with the crimes. Although there have been rumors that the Zodiac Killer may have been responsible for the murders, this has never been confirmed in any way, despite the fact that several members of law enforcement and the press have speculated about it. Number 8. The Doodler. During the 1970s, being gay in the United States was a highly challenging and, at times, quite frightening experience. There was a predator of young gay males during that time period who appeared to have a terrifyingly clear understanding of the fact that prejudice may raise its ugly head at any moment, even in areas that were reasonably accepting of homosexuality. The press gave him a variety of nicknames, including Doodler and Black Doodler, since he carried out his murders in this manner. He would enter the homes of his victims as a companion, then sketch them before stabbing them to death. This was how he was known as the Doodler. Isn't that very creepy? Beginning in January 1974 and continuing through February 1975, there were at least 14 young gay males who were murdered. There were 3 more people who were attacked, but they managed to survive. Nonetheless, the case has not been solved because the people who survived refused to reveal their identities by testifying against the primary suspect. In spite of the fact that these murders took place in San Francisco, which was one of the most welcoming regions of the United States at the time, the victims were more concerned about the consequences of coming out than they were about the individual who attempted to take their lives. A public personality and a diplomat from the United States were 2 of these individuals who managed to survive. As a gay man himself, Harvey Milk, who was serving as mayor of San Francisco at the time, made the following statement: "I can understand their position. I have a reasonable regard for the strain that society has placed on them. Nonetheless, I have the impression that they do not wish to be revealed." Unfortuitously, the authorities never identified or apprehended a suspect, and the investigation has been going on for a very long time. Number 7. West Mesa Bone Collector. A human bone was found by a dog walker in February 2009 on the West Mesa in Albuquerque, New Mexico. This specific location is known as the West Mesa, the dumping grounds of an unnamed killer who was known to the locals as the Bone Collector, were the outcome of this finding, which led to the creation of the greatest crime scene in the history of the United States. The remains of 11 women, all of whom were prostitutes, were eventually excavated from the location. Yet, in the years that have passed since then, not a single piece of evidence that could be considered hopeful has been discovered. Nothing has been discovered, including DNA, probable murder weapons, and possible descriptions of the suspect's personal characteristics. Sex workers in the neighborhood continue to live in fear of the killer, despite the fact that there have been no killings associated with him for years. Some unscrupulous clients even find a way to acquire the acquiescence of prostitutes by implying that they might be the killer. It was stated by the founder of Safe Sex Work, a local non-profit organization, that he is their bogeyman. The local police have ceased dismissing accusations of rapes and beatings committed against sex workers in the area, and a bad date list, a directory of local males who have abused prostitutes, is now being updated on a regular basis. People who operate in the sex industry in the area have grown extremely cautious, and while this may have been a factor in thwarting the operations of the killer, his identity is still a mystery. Number 6. The Alphabet Murders. At the beginning of the 1970s, the region surrounding Rochester, New York was completely shaken by a string of terrible murders. Although all of the victims were young girls, that was not the only thing that they shared in common. Due to the fact that Carmen Colon, Wanda Walkowicz, and Michelle Maenza all had initials that were alliterative, the media initially referred to the incidents as the double initial killings. However, they eventually changed its name to the more catchy alphabet murders. There were a lot of persons who were questioned in connection with these atrocities, and one suspect who committed himself not long after the last murder was regarded to be the most likely culprit for a very long time. That is, until DNA testing in 2007 exonerated him of any wrongdoing after his death. Similar to the last example, it was believed that an uncle of one of the victims was a primary suspect. However, he was never charged with the crime, and he was eventually exonerated when DNA testing became available. Kenneth Bianchi, who was born and raised in Rochester, has also been the subject of suspicion for a considerable amount of time. After traveling to Los Angeles, he and his cousin perpetrated the murders that are attributed to the Hillside Strangler. Although Bianchi has never been officially cleared of the Rochester killings, he has also never been charged with the crimes, and he continues to claim his innocence. Additionally, in 2011, New Yorker Joseph Nasso, who was 77 years old at the time, was charged with the murder of 4 women who had been murdered in California in the late 1970s. It is quite unlikely that he would have been taken into consideration in regard to the Rochester case if it weren't for the identities of the people who were killed by him: Roxane Ragash, Pamela Parsons, Tracy Tafoya, and amazingly, another Carmen Colon. However, as of the time this article was written, Nasso's trial in the California crimes has been continually postponed, and he has not been charged with the murders that occurred in Rochester on the alphabet. Number 5. The Monster of Florence. A monstrous creature was said to prowl the streets of Florence, Italy, between the years 1968 and 1985. He, or she, was armed with a pistol of .22 caliber and was responsible for the death of 16 individuals, as well as the occasional mutilation of the genitals of female victims, before mysteriously disappearing. The killer nearly usually targeted couples, and the authorities have been completely unsuccessful in their efforts to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they have solved the case. During the course of the inquiry, they conducted interviews with over 100,000 individuals. 4 separate persons have been found guilty of the killings at 4 different periods. Of course, it is impossible for all of them to be responsible for all of the murders. Several other people have been taken into custody in connection with the crimes, but they were freed after the perpetrator of the crime struck once again using the same weapon and method of operation. Independent investigations have reached the conclusion that Antonio Vinci, a relative of 2 other suspects in the murders, is a likely culprit. Vinci is still alive and free, and in 2008 he maintained his innocence in an appearance with Dateline NBC. Vinci is a suspect in the murders. Nearly 30 years after the incident that resulted in the last murder, it appears that a resolution is extremely unlikely, regardless of who the monster is or was. Highway of Tears, Murders, Number 4. Roadway 16 in Canada, which is approximately 900 miles long and runs through the middle of British Columbia, is home to some of the most breathtaking scenery of any roadway in the world. Consequently, it is peculiar that it is referred to as the Highway of Tears, until one takes into consideration the fact that it passes through a number of regions that are so remote that no one will be present to hear the screams when something terrible begins to occur. It is true that these incidents have taken place. During the course of the past few decades, there have been no fewer than 40 instances of young ladies going missing while hitchhiking on the highway. For many years, many people faulted the Canadian police for their inability to conduct investigations that were adequate. However, some people believe that the inquiry did not start in earnest until 2002, when a white victim was killed. This is because the majority of the victims were Inuit or people of color. The authorities acknowledge that the region is extremely challenging to successfully patrol. Logging roads stretch for hundreds of miles before reaching a dead end. Many portions of the highway itself are empty, with no settlements for miles. And even mobile phone connection is spotty or non-existent for large stretches of the highway. It goes without saying that there is a significant likelihood that the disappearances are the result of the actions of more than one murderer. The suspicions of a few individuals who have been convicted of murders in the United States have been raised in connection with some of the crimes that have been committed in Canada. However, nothing has ever been shown to be true. Furthermore, all of these individuals have been completely ruled out in at least some of the Highway of Tears cases. As long as the highway continues to provide wide, isolated areas that serve as hunting grounds for predators, it is quite likely that there will continue to be prey. 3. The murders known as Paturis Park. In the city of Sao Paulo, Brazil, which is home to one of the most active LGBT populations in South America, the killer who is known as the Rainbow Maniac has been targeting gay men for a number of years. Paturis Park had become a popular hookup location until it became a stalking ground for a maniac. The neighborhood played host to the largest annual gay pride march on the world, and Paturis Park had become a popular hookup spot. Since the year 2007, the park has been the location of 13 homicides that have taken place. The authorities have a feeling that their suspect may be a present or former law enforcement officer, and they believe that the same murderer may also be responsible for 3 further fatalities that occurred in the state of Osasco, which is located close. In point of fact, in 2008, local newspapers reported that retired officer Jairo Francisco Franco had been captured and that the police were confident that they had their man in custody. The investigation, on the other hand, has not resulted in any accusations or convictions, and it has not been resolved to this day. 2. Bible John. A murderer who referred to himself as Bible John was responsible for the deaths of 3 young women from Scotland in the late 1960s. The murderer cited passages from the Bible in his crimes. In every single one of the victims, their own stockings were used to suffocate them. In addition, all of the victims were menstruating at the time of their deaths, and it is reasonable to assume that the perpetrator was aware of this fact, as pads or tampons were found close to the bodies of each of the victims. Jean Puttock, the sister of the victim Helen Puttock, was able to provide the only known description of the perpetrator after spending an hour in a taxi with him, and her sister, who was also destined to die. The man had referred to himself as John Templeton, and he had cited numerous passages from the Bible. He had even referred to the varieties of dance halls in where he had met his victims as dens of iniquity. Immediately following the departure of Jean and her date from the taxi, Helen proceeded on with John, only to be discovered dead the following morning. Without a trace, the man vanished without a trace. The Boston Strangler, number 1. In the month of July in the year 1962, the Boston Herald published an article that proclaimed, "Mad Strangler Kills 4 Women in Boston," on its top page. The case was one that captured the attention of the general public, and it is possible that the resolution to the case will not be a resolution at all. There were 13 ladies in the Boston region who were murdered between the years 1962 and 1964. Their ages ranged from 19 to 85 for the women. Every single one of them was suffocated with silk stockings. Almost all of them were subjected to sexual abuse, and there was never any indication that their homes had been broken into. In October 1964, a man named Albert DeSalvo, who had been arrested for raping a woman in her own home, confessed in detail to the killings, and he was ultimately found guilty of the crimes under investigation. Although DeSalvo was able to provide information on the crime sites that had not been made public, He also managed to get a significant number of these elements wrong, which is a remarkable feat. The individual in question was incarcerated in a mental facility at the time of his confession, and he was subsequently condemned to a life sentence in jail. It was never addressed, however, that his confession had contradictions, such as incorrect hours of death, the method of strangling, and other such details. Even more concerning is the fact that the police had always been of the opinion that the murders were probably the work of more than one person. In fact, DNA evidence has exonerated DeSalvo of one of the murders to which he had confessed. John E. Douglas, an FBI agent who worked on the case and was one of the first people to ever create a criminal profile, has indicated that, based on DeSalvo's profile, it is highly doubtful that he committed the killings, but it is highly likely that he intended to claim credit for them. Therefore, despite the fact that the murders have been committed for more than 40 years, there is still a possibility that one of the most notorious serial killers in the history of the world is still at large. And there you have it, folks. 10 bone-chilling tales of serial murderers who have never been brought to justice. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Creepshow for more deep dives into the macabre. Leave a comment below and let us know which unsolved mystery haunts you the most. And if you have any theories about these elusive killers, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, sometimes the truth is more terrifying than fiction.